On Tommy's graduation photo, "Knew you'd change the world with that brain of yours, son. Your mama would be so proud." On a picture of Jack in dress uniform, "You got your grandfather's courage and your mama's heart. I should have told you that when you left." The third box, buried near Mary Alice's rose garden, contained perhaps the most heartbreaking treasures of all. These are letters Frank had written but never sent. Letters to his wife after she passed, sharing daily events and asking for her guidance in dealing with their sons. Letters to his own father, long dead, seeking advice about how to repair the damage his pride had caused. But most painful of all were the letters addressed to each of his sons individually, chronicling his daily thoughts and feelings, his hopes and fears, his love and his loneliness. These weren't the formal, carefully composed letters from the first box. These were raw, emotional outpourings of a father's heart, written during the long, lonely nights when regret and love warred within his chest. Reading these private letters felt almost like eavesdropping on their father's conversations with God, and yet Frank had clearly intended for them to be found and read. They were his way of finally sharing the depth of his feelings, the complexity of his emotions, and the simple, overwhelming truth of his love for his sons. By the time they'd read through all the letters from the first 3 boxes, it was well past midnight, and all 3 brothers were emotionally exhausted. They sat in Frank's kitchen, the same kitchen where they'd eaten countless meals as children, and tried to process the revelation of their father's hidden emotional life. 25 years, Tommy said finally, his voice hollow with grief and wonder. 25 years he's been writing to us, talking to us, loving us, and we never knew. All those times I thought he didn't care. All those years I convinced myself he was better off without me. Jack nodded, understanding exactly what his brother meant. I kept waiting for him to write, to call, to give me some sign that he was proud of what I was doing. And all this time he was proud. He was following every step of my career, savant every article, celebrating every promotion. He just couldn't find a way to tell me. Bill, who had stayed closest to home and witnessed Frank's decline into isolation and depression, perhaps understood better than his brothers the prison their father had created for himself. "He loved us so much it paralyzed him," he said softly. "He was so afraid of saying the wrong thing, of driving us further away, that he ended up saying nothing at all. And the longer he waited, the harder it became to break that silence." But even as they mourned the lost years and missed opportunities, the brothers were beginning to understand that Frank's treasure hunt was about more than just revealing his hidden feelings. The careful planning, the multiple locations, the progressive revelation of deeper and deeper truths. It was all designed to bring them together, to force them to work as a team, to rediscover the bonds that had made them brothers rather than just related strangers. The 4th box, hidden in a location that took them 2 days to find based on Frank's cryptic clues, contained legal documents that revealed the true scope of their father's final gift. The farm, which they'd assumed would need to be sold and divided, had been restructured over the years into a family trust with specific provisions that would keep the property intact while providing each son with both responsibility and benefit. Frank had worked with lawyers and financial advisors to create a legacy that honored each son's different strengths and interests. Tommy's legal expertise would be needed to manage the complex trust structure. Jack's organizational skills would help oversee the agricultural operations. Bill's intimate knowledge of the land and the community would provide the foundation for day-to-day management. But the most important provision in the trust was one that none of them expected. Frank had designated a portion of the farm to be developed as a retreat center for military families, honoring Jack's service while providing a meaningful way for all 3 brothers to contribute to something larger than themselves. The retreat center would offer respite and healing for soldiers returning from deployment, their families dealing with the stresses of military life, and veterans struggling with the transition back to civilian society. It would be built around the farmhouse where the Henderson boys had learned about love and loss, incorporating Mary Alice's rose garden as a place of beauty and reflection. Frank had even arranged the initial funding through careful investment of the farm's profits over the years, along with life insurance policies the boys never knew existed. He'd thought of everything. The legal structure, the financial foundation, the operational framework, and most importantly, the shared purpose that would give his sons a reason to work together and stay connected. But Frank Henderson wasn't finished with his surprises. There was one more box, and this one wasn't marked on either of the maps they'd found. Bill discovered it purely by accident when he was moving some of Frank's old equipment out of the barn to make room for the restoration work they were planning. It was tucked up in the rafters, wrapped in canvas, and secured with rope that had been tied with the same precise knots Frank had learned in the Navy 50 years earlier. The box was smaller than the others, but somehow felt heavier, weighted with significance that went beyond its physical contents. Inside were 3 letters, one for each son, but these were different from all the others they'd found. These weren't chronicles of daily life or expressions of long-suppressed emotions. These were instructions, written in Frank's steadiest hand, for how to heal the wounds that had grown between them over the years. For Tommy, there was a letter that began, "Son, I know I never understood your need to leave this place, your hunger for something bigger than what I could offer. I saw it as rejection when I should have seen it as ambition. I was proud of you every day, but I was also scared every day that you'd become someone I couldn't relate to, someone who'd outgrown his old man and his simple ways." The letter went on to acknowledge Frank's mistakes, his inability to express pride without mixing it with worry, his tendency to see Tommy's success as somehow diminishing the value of the life Frank had built. But most importantly, it contained something Tommy had waited his whole life to hear. "You didn't abandon us when you left for college," Frank had written. "You honored us. You took the values your mother and I tried to teach you, hard work, integrity, standing up for what's right, and you used them to make a difference in the world. Every case you won for someone who couldn't fight for themselves, every time you stood up to powerful people who were abus in their position, every moment you chose justice over profit, that was the Henderson way, just applied to a different kind of work than I ever imagined." For Jack, there was recognition of the courage it took to serve his country, and a profound apology for not supporting his decision to join the military. Frank had been scared of losing another son to war, but he'd let that fear come between them instead of expressing his pride in Jack's willingness to serve something greater than himself. "I was wrong to fight you on joining the Army," Frank's letter admitted. "I was thinking like a scared father instead of like a man who'd serve himself. I knew what it meant to wear the uniform, to stand ready to defend freedom and protect the innocent. I should have been proud that my son wanted to carry on that tradition instead of scared that I might lose him to it." The letter detailed Frank's growing understanding of Jack's military career, his pride in his son's decorations and promotions, and his regret that his own fear had prevented him from being the supportive father a soldier needs when he's far from home. And for Bill, there was perhaps the most complex letter of all, gratitude for staying close, but also encouragement to spread his wings if that's what his heart called for. Frank had worried that Bill had stayed out of obligation rather than choice, and he wanted his youngest to know that he had his father's blessing to chase his own dreams. "You gave up more than your brothers ever knew," Frank had written. "You put your own plans on hold to take care of me and the farm. And I let you do it because I was selfish and scared of being alone. But I want you to know that your sacrifice wasn't wasted. You kept the Henderson name strong in this community. You showed people what loyalty and dedication look like. And you proved that sometimes the greatest adventure is standing by the people you love when they need you most." But the most important item in that final box wasn't a letter at all. It was a small, leather-bound journal filled with Frank's careful observations about each of his sons, their strengths, their struggles, their dreams, and their fears. It was like reading a masterclass in fatherhood, as Frank analyzed his own mistakes and planned strategies for bringing his family back together. The journal revealed the true scope of Frank's treasure hunt. Every box, every location, every revelation had been carefully orchestrated to create specific emotional experiences and force particular conversations between his sons. He'd studied them like a general planning a campaign, understanding their personalities well enough to predict how they'd react to each discovery. But more than that, the journal showed how Frank had spent his final years not just mourning what he'd lost, but actively working to repair it. He'd researched family therapy techniques, read books about communication and conflict resolution, and consulted with counselors about how to heal relationships damaged by years of silence and misunderstanding. The treasure hunt wasn't just about revealing Frank's love. It was about teaching his sons how to love each other again. The brothers spent the next several weeks at the farm, longer than any of them had planned, but exactly as long as they needed. They read and reread their father's letters, shared stories from their separate lives, and began the slow, sometimes painful process of getting to know each other as adults rather than the children they'd been when they'd gone their separate ways. Tommy told them about the loneliness of success, how climbing the ladder in a big law firm could be isolating even when you were surrounded by colleagues and clients. He'd built a reputation as one of the best civil rights attorneys in Texas, fighting for people who couldn't fight for themselves, but he'd never felt truly connected to anyone who understood where he came from or what had shaped him. Jack shared stories from his military career that he'd never told anyone. The weight of command, the responsibility for other people's lives, the way deployment could make you feel like a stranger in your own family. He'd served with honor in conflicts around the world, earned the respect of his fellow soldiers and the gratitude of his country, but he'd never stopped feeling like something was missing from his life. And Bill, for the first time, admitted to the dreams he'd deferred and the paths he'd never explored. He'd built a good life in their hometown, married a wonderful woman, raised children he was proud of, and become a respected member of the community. But he'd always wondered what might have happened if he'd had the courage to chase his own ambitions instead of staying home to care for their father. As they worked together to restore the farmhouse and plan the military retreat center, the three brothers began to discover something their father had understood long before they did. They needed each other. Tommy's legal expertise was essential for navigating the complex regulations involved in establishing a nonprofit organization. Jack's leadership experience was crucial for designing programs that would truly serve military families. And Bill's deep roots in the community provided the foundation of trust and support they'd need to make their vision a reality. But more than their professional skills, they needed each other's perspectives, each other's strengths, and each other's love. Tommy needed to remember where he came from and what really mattered. Jack needed a place to belong when his military career ended. And Bill needed to know that his sacrifice had meaning and that his brothers valued what he'd given up for the family. The restoration of the farmhouse became a metaphor for the restoration of their relationship. Room by room, board by board, they rebuilt not just their childhood home, but their connection to each other. They argued sometimes, the way brothers do, but now their arguments were productive rather than destructive, focused on solving problems rather than assigning blame. Mary Alice's rose garden, which had been allowed to grow wild during Frank's final years, became their joint project and their shared symbol of renewal. They researched the varieties she'd planted, learned proper pruning and care techniques, and spent countless hours working side by side to restore it to its former beauty. As the roses began to bloom again, responding to care and attention after years of neglect, the brothers began to understand the deeper message in their father's elaborate treasure hunt. Love, like roses, needs tending. Relationships, like gardens, require constant care and attention. And sometimes, when things have been neglected for too long, the only way to restore them is to start over with patience, dedication, and faith that something beautiful can grow from even the most tangled roots. The Military Retreat Center opened 2 years after Frank's death, on a perfect spring day when the roses were in full bloom and the old oak tree was thick with new leaves. The first families to stay, there were a young soldier recovering from injuries sustained in Afghanistan and his wife and children, who had been struggling to reconnect after his long deployment. Watching that family explore the grounds, seeing the children play in the same fields where the Henderson boys had once run and laughed, witnessing the gradual healing that comes from being in a place designed specifically for restoration and renewal. It was like seeing Frank's vision come to life in the most beautiful way possible. The retreat center incorporated elements from each brother's life and experience. Tommy had designed legal workshops to help military families navigate benefits and rights issues. Jack had developed outdoor adventure programs that built confidence and teamwork. Bill had created agricultural therapy sessions where families could work together in Mary Alice's restored garden, learning that growth requires patience, care, and the right conditions. But the heart of the retreat center was the farmhouse itself, preserved exactly as it had been during the Henderson family's golden years. The kitchen where Mary Alice had prepared countless meals still welcomed hungry families. The front porch where Frank had told stories still provided a place for sharing and healing. The bedrooms where 3 boys had grown up still offered shelter and safety to children whose lives had been disrupted by the demands of military service. Every year on the anniversary of finding Frank's first map, the Henderson brothers and their families gathered at the farm. It became a tradition that grew larger each year as children became adults and brought their own families to honor the man who had loved them enough to find a way to bring them home. These annual gatherings became legendary in the county, drawing not just family members but friends, neighbors, and retreat center guests who had been touched by Frank's legacy. There would be baseball games in the pasture, fishing expeditions to the creek, and storytelling sessions on the front porch that echoed the best traditions of their childhood. But the most important part of each gathering was the reading of Frank's letters. Each year, different family members would take turns sharing passages that had particular meaning for them, keeping Frank's words and wisdom alive for new generations who had never known him personally, but who benefited daily from his love and foresight. As the years passed, the Henderson brothers grew older and grayer, but their bond only grew stronger. Tommy eventually opened a satellite office in their hometown, spending more time on the farm and taking on cases that served the local community. Jack retired from the military and became the full-time director of the retreat center, finally finding the sense of purpose and belonging he'd been seeking his entire career. Bill expanded his own family's involvement in the retreat center, bringing his children and eventually his grandchildren into the mission of serving military families. His son took over much of the agricultural work, learning the same lessons about land and legacy that had shaped generations of Henderson men. The carved map in the barn became a focal point for visitors, preserved behind glass with a plaque that told the story of Frank Henderson and his final gift to his sons. But more than a historical artifact, it served as a reminder that love sometimes requires elaborate planning, that healing takes time and patience, and that the most valuable treasures are often hidden in the most ordinary places. Tourists and researchers came from around the country to study the Henderson family story, fascinated by Frank's innovative approach to family reconciliation and impressed by the successful model of the military retreat center. Articles were written, documentaries were filmed, and graduate students wrote theses about the psychological and sociological implications of Frank's treasure hunt. But for the Henderson family, the real legacy wasn't the attention or accolades. It was the knowledge that love had conquered pride, that family had overcome estrangement, and that one man's determination to heal his relationships had created something beautiful that would serve others for generations to come. Tommy often reflected on how different his life might have been if he'd never found those letters, never understood the depth of his father's love and pride. The knowledge that Frank had been following his career, celebrating his victories, and sharing his struggles had given Tommy a sense of connection to his roots that transformed not just his relationship with his family, but his entire approach to his work and his life. Jack found peace in understanding that his father's resistance to his military service had come from love rather than disapproval. Knowing that Frank had eventually come to understand and respect his choice gave Jack the closure he needed to fully embrace both his military identity and his Henderson heritage. And Bill discovered that his sacrifice had not only been seen and appreciated, but had been the foundation upon which Frank had built his entire reconciliation plan. Far from being taken for granted, Bill's loyalty and dedication had made him the cornerstone of his father's strategy for healing their family. The military families who stayed at the retreat center often asked about the story behind the place, and the Henderson brothers never tired of telling it. They would walk guests through the farmhouse, show them the carved map in the barn, and share the letters that had brought them back together. These conversations inevitably led to discussions about the guests' own family relationships, their own struggles with communication and connection, and their own need for healing and reconciliation. Many families left the retreat center not just refreshed and restored, but inspired to apply the lessons of Frank's treasure hunt to their own lives. Some guests started their own family traditions based on what they'd learned at the Henderson farm. Others reached out to estranged relatives, inspired by the brothers' story, to take the first difficult steps toward reconciliation. Still others simply carried the message that love is worth fighting for, even when pride and time seemed to have made healing impossible. The impact of Frank Henderson's final gift rippled out far beyond his own family, touching lives and healing relationships in ways he never could have imagined. His simple farmer's wisdom about the importance of family, the power of persistent love, and the need to sometimes take extraordinary measures to preserve what matters most became a model that inspired countless others. As I sit here on my porch tonight, watching the same sun set over the same rolling hills that Frank Henderson loved so dearly, I can't help but think about the legacy he left behind. Not just the farm or the retreat center, or even the reconciliation of his sons, but the example of what's possible when we refuse to let pride and hurt feelings have the final word in our most important relationships. Frank spent the last years of his life planning and preparing, carving and writing, hiding and hoping. He could have used that time to nurse his grievances, to justify his silence, to convince himself that his sons had made their choices and would have to live with the consequences. Instead, he chose to love them enough to find a way past his own limitations, to bridge the gap that his own stubborn heart had created. The Henderson brothers often talk about how different their story might have been if their father had simply swallowed his pride and picked up the phone, if he'd written a letter or made a visit or found some simpler way to express his love. But I think they're missing the point of what Frank accomplished. Sometimes the greatest gifts require the greatest effort. Sometimes healing demands more than good intentions and simple gestures. Sometimes love has to be as elaborate and persistent and creative as the wounds it's trying to heal. Frank understood that his sons needed more than words. They needed proof. Proof that he'd been thinking about them, caring about them, following their lives, and celebrating their achievements even when he couldn't find a way to tell them directly. They needed to know that his love was real and deep and lasting, not just a deathbed sentiment or a guilt-driven afterthought. The treasure hunt gave them that proof in the most powerful way possible. Every buried box was evidence of Frank's planning and preparation. Every letter was testimony to his long-term devotion. Every clue was confirmation that he'd known and understood them better than they'd realized. But more than that, the treasure hunt forced them to work together, to spend time on the land that had shaped them, to remember why family matters more than the disagreements that pull us apart. Frank knew that simply telling his sons to forgive each other wouldn't work. He had to create circumstances that would allow forgiveness to grow naturally from shared experience and renewed understanding. The Military Retreat Center continues to operate today, more than 20 years after Frank's death. It's expanded beyond the original farmhouse to include additional buildings and programs, but it's still rooted in the same principles that guided Frank's approach to healing his own family: patience, persistence, love, and the belief that broken things can be made beautiful again. The current director is Bill's daughter, Sarah, who grew up hearing the story of her grandfather's treasure hunt and absorbed its lessons about the importance of family and the power of love to overcome seemingly impossible obstacles. Under her leadership, the Retreat Center has become a model for similar programs around the country, proof that Frank's vision was not only achievable but replicable. Every family that stays at the Retreat Center leaves with a printed copy of Frank's story and a challenge to examine their own relationships, to identify the treasures they might be burying through pride or fear or simple neglect. The response has been overwhelming, with hundreds of letters over the years from people who found the courage to reach out to estranged family members, to heal old wounds, or to prevent new ones from festering. One letter that particularly moved the Henderson family came from a Vietnam veteran who had been estranged from his son for 15 years over political differences. After hearing Frank's story during a stay at the Retreat Center, he went home and wrote his own series of letters to his son, eventually rebuilding a relationship that had seemed permanently broken. Another came from a military widow whose grown children had been fighting over their father's estate and legacy. She used Frank's approach of hiding meaningful gifts and messages around her home, creating her own treasure hunt that forced her children to work together and remember what really mattered. These stories, and hundreds of others like them, prove that Frank Henderson's legacy extends far beyond his own family. His example of persistent, creative, sacrificial love has inspired a movement of healing that continues to grow and spread, touching lives and mending relationships in ways that would have amazed and delighted the humble farmer who started it all. The carved map in the barn has become a pilgrimage site of sorts, with people traveling from around the world to see the physical evidence of Frank's love and determination. But more than a tourist attraction, it serves as a reminder that the most important maps we create are not the ones that show us where to go, but the ones that show us how to find our way back home. As the Henderson brothers have aged, they've begun their own planning for the next generation. They've involved their children and grandchildren in the operation of the retreat center, teaching them the lessons Frank taught about land and legacy, love and persistence. They've established educational scholarships, created endowments, and built systems that will ensure Frank's work continues long after they're gone. But most importantly, they've passed on the story itself. The tale of a stubborn farmer who loved his sons enough to spend his final years planning an elaborate treasure hunt that would bring them back together. It's a story that gets told and retold, adapted and applied, shared and celebrated by everyone whose life it touches. Tommy, now in his 70s and still practicing law part-time, often speaks at conferences about family reconciliation and conflict resolution. He uses his father's story as an example of how creative persistence can overcome seemingly insurmountable relationship challenges, and he challenges his audiences to think beyond traditional approaches to healing family wounds. Jack, retired from the military but still serving as an advisor to the retreat center, has written a book about Frank's treasure hunt and its impact on military families. The book has become required reading in several military family life programs and has been translated into multiple languages for international military communities. Bill, the keeper of the farm and the guardian of Frank's legacy, continues to live in the original farmhouse, surrounded by the physical reminders of his father's love and wisdom. He gives tours to visitors, tends Mary Alice's roses, and serves as the living connection between Frank's vision and its ongoing reality. All three brothers have grown children who are actively involved in continuing their grandfather's work. Tommy's daughter is a family therapist who specializes in military families and uses Frank's story in her practice. Jack's son runs adventure therapy programs at the retreat center, helping troubled teens and struggling families find healing through outdoor challenges and teamwork. Bill's children manage various aspects of the retreat center's operations, from agriculture to administration to program development. The third generation of Hendersons is now having children of their own, ensuring that Frank's legacy will continue into the future. These great-grandchildren, who never knew Frank personally, are growing up with the story as part of their family mythology, understanding from an early age the importance of family loyalty, persistent love, and creative problem-solving. The annual family gatherings have evolved into multi-day celebrations that attract not just Henderson family members, but also retreat center alumni, military families from around the region, and anyone whose life has been touched by Frank's story. These gatherings feature workshops on family communication, seminars on military family life, and storytelling sessions where people share their own experiences with family healing and reconciliation. One of the most popular traditions at these gatherings is the creation of new treasure hunts, where families work together to design their own maps and hide their own meaningful gifts for each other. Children and adults collaborate to create puzzles and challenges that reveal family history, express love and appreciation, and strengthen bonds between generations. These modern treasure hunts have become so popular that the Retreat Center now offers workshops on creating family treasure hunts as a tool for communication and bonding. Families learn the principles Frank used: understanding your audience, creating meaningful challenges, revealing information gradually, and using the process itself as a way to bring people together. The success of these programs has led to the development of corporate team-building exercises based on Frank's approach, marriage enrichment retreats that use treasure hunt principles to help couples reconnect, and educational programs that teach children about family history through interactive exploration and discovery. But perhaps the most profound impact of Frank's story has been its influence on how people think about death and legacy. Instead of seeing death as an ending, Frank's example shows how careful planning and creative love can make death a beginning, the start of new relationships, new understanding, and new opportunities for healing and growth. Estate planners and family counselors now regularly use Frank's story as an example of how to leave more than just financial assets to the next generation. They encourage clients to think about emotional legacies, relationship repairs, and creative ways to communicate love and wisdom to family members who might otherwise never receive these gifts. The legal profession has taken particular interest in Frank's approach, with several law schools using his story in courses on estate planning and family law. The idea of using legal structures and careful planning to facilitate emotional healing rather than just financial distribution has opened up new ways of thinking about what it means to leave a meaningful legacy. Military communities have embraced Frank's story as an example of how civilian families can understand and support military service members and their families. The Retreat Center has become a model for similar programs on military bases around the world, and Frank's letters to Jack have been used in military family life education programs to help parents understand how to support children who choose military careers. Mental health professionals have studied Frank's approach as an innovative form of family therapy, noting how his careful orchestration of discovery and revelation created the conditions necessary for healing without forcing confrontation or requiring his sons to take emotional risks they weren't ready for. The agricultural community has celebrated Frank as an example of how farming families can adapt to changing times while preserving their essential values and traditions. The transformation of his farm from a traditional agricultural operation to a service-oriented retreat center demonstrates how family land can remain productive and meaningful even when the next generation chooses different career paths. Religious communities have found inspiration in Frank's story as an example of sacrificial love, forgiveness, and the kind of patient, persistent faith that can move mountains, or at least move stubborn hearts toward reconciliation and healing. Educators have used oriented retreat center demonstrates how family land can remain productive and meaningful even when the next generation chooses different career paths. Religious communities have found inspiration in Frank's story as an example of sacrificial love, forgiveness, and the kind of patient, persistent faith that can move mountains, or at least move stubborn hearts toward reconciliation and healing. Educators have used Frank's treasure hunt as a model for project-based learning, showing how carefully designed challenges can engage multiple learning styles, encourage collaboration, and create memorable experiences that teach important life lessons along with academic content. The story has been adapted into multiple formats over the years. Children's books that teach about family love and forgiveness, documentary films that explore the psychology of family reconciliation, academic studies that analyze the effectiveness of Frank's approach, and even a stage play that brings the emotional journey of the Henderson family to life for live audiences. But regardless of how it's told or what format it takes, the core message of Frank's story remains the same. Love is worth fighting for. Family relationships can be healed even after years of estrangement. And sometimes the most ordinary people can accomplish the most extraordinary things when they're motivated by deep, persistent, creative love. As the sun sets tonight over the Henderson farm, painting the sky in those same colors that have marked the end of countless days on this beautiful piece of American land, I can't help but think about all the lives that have been touched by one stubborn farmer's refusal to let pride have the final word in his family story. Frank Henderson never became famous during his lifetime. He never wrote a book, never gave speeches, never appeared on television or had his picture in the newspaper. He lived quietly, worked hard, loved deeply, and died peacefully, surrounded by the land and the memories that had shaped his entire life. But through his final gift to his sons, Frank created a legacy that has touched thousands of lives and inspired countless acts of love, forgiveness, and reconciliation. His story proves that you don't have to be famous or wealthy or powerful to change the world. You just have to love someone enough to find a way past your own limitations and their defenses to reach the heart of what really matters. The treasure map carved into the barn wall is still there, still drawing visitors from around the world, still serving as a reminder that the most valuable treasures are often hidden in the most ordinary places. But the real map Frank created was the one he drew in his sons' hearts, the one that led them back to each other and back to the understanding that family is the most valuable treasure any of us can leave behind. If this story has touched your heart tonight, if it's made you think about your own family relationships or inspired you to reach out to someone you've been estranged from, then Frank Henderson's legacy lives on. Go ahead and hit that like button, subscribe to hear more stories from this old porch, and most importantly, share this tale with someone who might need to hear about the power of persistent love and the possibility of second chances. Remember, we're all creating maps for the people who come after us, whether we realize it or not. Every choice we make, every word we speak, every act of love or selfishness becomes part of the legacy we leave behind. Frank Henderson chose to make his final map one that led his family toward healing, forgiveness, and renewed love. What kind of map are you creating? Where will it lead the people you love most? And what treasures are you hiding or failing to share that could change someone's life forever? The stars are coming out now over this beautiful American countryside. The same stars that shone down on Frank Henderson as he worked late into the night, carving his love in a barnwood and planning his final gift to his boys. Somewhere out there, in towns and cities across this great land of ours, there are other families struggling with estrangement and hurt feelings, other parents wondering how to reach children who seem to have grown beyond their touch, other children yearning for the approval and love they never received. Frank Henderson's story is proof that it's never too late to start drawing a new map, never too late to plan a better ending, never too late to love someone enough to find a way past pride and hurt and all the obstacles that keep hearts apart. Until next time, friends, remember that family isn't just about blood. It's about the bonds we choose to honor and the love we choose to leave behind. Y'all take care now, and may your own treasure maps lead to healing, hope, and the kind of love that transcends even death itself.